A Londres llegué en octubre de 1996, sin hablar una sola palabra de inglés, con una carta que decía que estaba matriculado en el Hampstead School of English. Me acuerdo que me pusieron muy orgullosamente ni siquiera se llamaba beginner, sino elementary. Y la primera clase aprendimos los colores. Blue, red, green. My name is Hernando. Pero así era, yo tenía 24 años. Ya pasé de elementary, pasé a beginners, pasé a intermediate, y en intermediate había un profesor que se llamaba William y me gustaba mucho sus clases porque el tipo lo que hacía es que escogía un tema y decía, bueno, hoy el tema hoy es tal y sobre esta cosa vamos a aprender vocabulario. Hoy vamos a hablar del miedo, esos momentos en que todos hemos vivido y que nos hemos estado realmente con mucho susto, mucho miedo. Entonces quiero que por favor todos cierren los ojos y piensen en los momentos más asustadores de su vida. Y yo realmente me tomaba la clase muy en serio y a mí esos ejercicios siempre me han gustado. Yo tuve una infancia bastante cómoda en Colombia, pero me sorprendió mucho que al cerrar los ojos me empezaron a llegar una cantidad de imágenes aterradoras de mi vida. La primera que tengo de memoria, yo estaba muy chiquito, tendría 5 o 6 años y a unas 10 cuadras de la casa, esto en el norte de Bogotá, hubo unos atracadores que entraron a casa y llegó la policía y hubo un intercambio de disparos. Me acuerdo que mis hermanos eran mayores, todos en bicicleta, salieron corriendo a mirar qué había pasado. Ya llegamos en el momento en que había un cordón policial, pero con el típico desorden, yo no sé cómo yo terminé metido dentro de la casa. Y alcancé a ver manchas de sangre y un cuerpo de alguien que le han disparado y que se había muerto. En el parque de mi casa donde jugaba, que era un parque de clase acomodada, digamos, que donde no le pasaba nada, había un senador que vivía por ahí y entonces estaba vigilado por unos PMs, como le decimos en Colombia, policía militar. Nosotros jugábamos fútbol y de golpe alguien en un carro le empezó a disparar a los PMs y él le empezó a disparar y nosotros terminamos botados en el piso como si fuera una película mientras disparaban. Me acordé también de una situación muy complicada haciendo reportería una vez que alguien me terminó poniendo un revólver en la cabeza y entonces yo estaba con todas esas imágenes en la cabeza y decía, uy, ¿cuál de estas voy a contar? ¿Cuál es la mejor para contar? Porque pues obviamente uno siempre quiere contar un buen cuento. Y en esas pasaron los 5 minutos y entonces William dijo, ok, vamos a ir entonces a contarnos. Entonces le preguntó al suizo, me acuerdo muy bien que empezó a hablar el suizo y dijo, no, yo me acuerdo una vez que llegué a la casa, abrí la puerta de la casa y mi mamá estaba detrás de la puerta y me hizo ¡bu! Y uy, me acuerdo el susto que me dio. Casi me muero del susto y mamá nunca pensé que me había sorprendido. Creo que era un sueco, una vez que se perdió en un centro comercial y que entonces un guardia lo tuvo y que fueron 20 minutos o media hora en que la mamá no aparecía y él lloraba. Y las historias eran todas como de ese estilo. Hasta que William me dice, ok, Hernando, what about you? Y ante el nivel sangriento de mis historias, decidí decirle, no, yo en realidad no me puedo acordar de ningún momento así como miedoso. Entonces, ay no, qué macho, me decía, latino macho, ¿no? Con su forma toda americana. Quedé como un pendejo, pero realmente no me daba la idea para contar ninguna de esas historias aterradoras que me tocó vivir porque crecí en Colombia.
Some of you don't. Some of you are just here because. I wanted to share with you that story you just heard, and also this tweet. This is like our big challenge. That's also a big challenge. But yeah, this is something it's always like people call us up and other podcasts want to work with us and other outlets. And they're like, oh, we love what you do. We love what you do. And I'm like, oh, great. Do you speak Spanish? And they're like, no, but we love what you do. So they never understand what we actually do. And it's a frustration for us because we're super proud of our work. But there's a bit of a language barrier, and so we like doing events like this so that people who don't speak Spanish can enjoy some of our content, our stories. We cover Latin America and U.S. Latinos, and we think language is very important. But we also like these spaces where people who don't speak Spanish can hear and participate. So that's why we were so excited to do this New York Times thing. So I'm going to tell one more story, and then we're going to have a conversation. Yeah, so I'll just jump right into it. When people talk about the special period in Cuba, el periodo especial, they usually mean those difficult years immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They mean the time after the Soviet Union collapsed and withdrew its subsidies before the island nation fell into a long economic funk. But if you look at it another way, the period of contemporary Cuban history that actually has been special in the sense of out of the ordinary or different was the era that came just before, the 70s and 80s. When Cuba could trade sugarcane and tobacco for oil, and like magic, socialism appeared to be working. This is Carla Suárez. She remembers.
Yo crecí en los años 70, nací en el 69, finales del 69, y los recuerdos que yo tengo de esa época, la verdad que son muy buenos.
Havana was safe and clean and felt open, like there was a future.
Yo soy de la generación que vivió, digamos, que la década de oro, si se le puede llamar, de la postrevolucionario, ¿no?
Let's get a few things out of the way. Yes, there was an embargo. Yes, there were scarcity and limits and government ration cards, and the Castro regime was autocratic and dissidents were jailed and worse. Yes, but the imminent threat of nuclear holocaust had eased, and there were good schools and good health care, and for many in Cuba there was a sense of shared sacrifice. Not a paradise, but nothing at all like the hard times that lay ahead. I'll focus on one small but not unimportant example: toys. A pretty defining element of childhood, right? So growing up in Cuba in the 70s and 80s, before it all went to hell, children were entitled to toys.
Entonces lo que se hacía era que cada niño tenía derecho a 3 juguetes.
3 toys, one from each of 3 different categories.
Uno se llamaba el básico, que era como el más importante, el más grande. Otro se llamaba el no básico, que era mediano, así. Y el otro era el dirigido, que era un juguetico simple, ¿no?
So the names are counterintuitive, right? But you get it. Básico, no básico, dirigido. They don't make that much sense in Spanish either, I promise you.
Y no sé, la muñeca más bonita a lo mejor era básico. No básico podía ser, por ejemplo, un juego de tacitas y cucharitas y platicos. Eso podía ser un no básico. Y dirigido podía ser un juego yaqui.
The year Carla was born is the year that Fidel canceled the Christmas holidays, so this great Cuban toy harvest happened in early summer.
Y entonces se hacía un sorteo con todas las libretas de abastecimiento, todas las familias con niños, y entonces te tocaba un número.
And that number dictated when you'd get to buy your toys. There were 6 toy buying days in all, a low number, and you might get to pick your toys on day 1 or day 2.
Y si a tu amigo le tocaba el primer día, ya empezabas a jugar con los juguetes de tu amigo el primer día.
Right, socialist solidarity. On the other hand, if you got a high number...
Pero después esperabas y después te daba tremenda rabia porque después te tocaba. A mí me toca un montón de veces el cuarto día. Y...
Sorry. Unless you think kids in socialist countries are kinder or more generous than you and I were when we were children, Carla assures me that no, they were not.
La crueldad de los niños creo que sobrepasa cualquier sistema.
Meaning that the day 1 kids with their fancy day 1 toys would make fun of the day 6 kids with their shitty day 6 toys. Because look, there really was a big difference between day 1 and day 6. For example, on day 1, when you chose your básico, you might be able to pick a guitar. But if, like Carla, you wanted a guitar on day 4...
Tenía la obsesión de comprar una guitarrita y cuando llegué la que quedaba no tenía cuerda.
When I spoke to Carla, I asked, foolishly, it turns out, but why didn't you just buy the guitar and get the strings separately?
Ah, no, claro, que ¿de dónde iba a sacar cuerdas? No, eso es un... No creo que se pudieran conseguir cuerdas así. En Cuba nosotros crecimos, mi generación, con lo que te toca.
Which means, quite simply...
Yo estoy acostumbrada solamente a uno. Y es el que me toca, ¿no? Es como que estás acostumbrado a que piensen por ti, aunque alguien te diga, papá, gobierno te diga lo que tienes que hacer, lo que te toca y lo que es correcto.
And Carla told me that when all that choosing is done for you, it has an impact. It shapes who you are.
No te desarrolla una parte que es la capacidad de elección, ¿no? De decir, yo quiero esto, prefiero lo otro, ¿no?
So maybe you want a toy in October or in January, but you can't have it because there aren't any toys to be had. That's just how it is. Okay, so I've already said that the 70s and the 80s, when Carla was growing up, these were the relatively good times. That was about to end. Carla was in college when it happened. She still remembers Havana as it was then, recalls it fondly, the optimism she and her friends felt, what it was like to be young and hopeful. When she started college,
Yo empecé con unos sueños de cosas que iba a hacer después de que me graduara.
and then
Our top story. The Iron Curtain between East Germany and West Berlin has come tumbling down. East Germany announced today it is opening its borders, allowing its citizens to go anywhere they wish.
En el 89 tumbaron el muro de Berlín, en el 91 se acabó la Unión Soviética.
and Cuba would never be the same. We have to acknowledge the irony here because world events have different meanings in different places. In Europe and across much of the world, the fall of the Berlin Wall meant so many things. Freedom, an end to dictatorship and repression, a reunited Germany. Meanwhile, in Cuba,
Y entonces cuando desapareció la Unión Soviética y todo el bloque, desapareció prácticamente todos los productos de los que nosotros vivíamos.
Nosotros planteamos que si debemos afrontar un periodo especial en época de paz, un duro periodo especial, nuestra tarea no debe ser solo la de sobrevivir, sino incluso la de desarrollarnos.
Y empezó a faltar todo en Cuba y claro, la problemática de los años 90 era ¿qué voy a comer hoy? ¿Qué voy a cocinar esta noche?
Ahora a este país se le pide un internacionalismo, una misión internacionalista extraordinaria, salvar la revolución en Cuba, salvar el socialismo en Cuba.
as Carla remembers it, in what amounts to an eye blink, Cuba became an entirely different country.
Fue muy abrupto porque era de un día para otro, empezó a cambiar todo, a cerrarse todo y sobre todo al principio de los años 90 se cerró prácticamente el país para nosotros, pero a nosotros nos dejaron dentro.
Carla describes the sense of an island, her beloved island, feeling suddenly smaller, oppressively small, and not just spiritually, practically.
Y los hoteles cerraron para nosotros y no se podía entrar, era para los turistas y los restaurantes también. Entonces de pronto el país completamente, el país al que tú podías entrar, acceso era tu país, ya no era tu país. Pero nosotros estábamos ahí.
There were places you couldn't go anymore because they wouldn't let you in, or places you couldn't get to because just moving around Cuba was suddenly really difficult.
Y entonces de pronto el transporte, que ya era malo, porque siempre ha sido muy malo el transporte ahí, ya desapareció prácticamente.
Cars and buses all but vanished from city streets.
Y entonces la opción que tuvo el gobierno para solucionar un poco la crisis esa fue las bicicletas. La ciudad está completamente inundada de bicicletas.
Thousands upon thousands of bicycles, imported from Russia, giant hulking Soviet bikes, thousands upon thousands more imported from China. This was something entirely new. Carla had never had a bike before, back when she was a kid.
No sé cuántas llegaban, pero llegaban muy pocas. Y por supuesto se acababan en los primeros números. Las bicicletas se acababan en los primeros 5 o 6 números, una cosa así.
But now during the special period with the island awash in bicycles, it was her turn. Carla was a student. She had to get to class.
Yo ahí estaba en la universidad, empezaron a dar las bicicletas. Yo dije, bueno, yo quiero una bicicleta, ya, ahora me toca.
She was entitled to a bike, but there was a catch.
Te hacían dar una vuelta para demostrar que tú sabías montar y te podías ir de la universidad con la bicicleta.
And she'd never learned to ride because she'd never had one. There were lots of students like Carla who didn't know how to ride, so if you wanted one, you could get a lesson right there on the spot. But Carla refused. Getting a bike lesson in front of everyone at the university, it was the kind of spectacle she simply wasn't willing to participate in.
Pero yo dije, no, yo tengo una reputación, yo no voy a ponerme a aprender a montar bicicleta delante de mis compañeros. ¿Qué van a pensar que yo a los 20 años no sé montar bicicleta?
So she left and went to learn on her own at her cousin's house, where she promptly fell over and broke her foot. She had to wear a cast, which actually ended up being a good thing.
Y entonces con el yeso fui a la universidad que me dieran la bicicleta. No podía demostrar que sabía montar porque tenía un yeso, pero le expliqué que era lógicamente yo sabía montar.
And they looked her over and said, sure, okay. And that's how, at age 20, Carla Suarez got her first ever Day One toy. Havana in the early 90s was a city beginning to fall apart in earnest. Fidel announced the beginning of this special period in 1990, and it never really ended. And this is what I want you to understand, how I've come to think about this little story. When you find yourself at a moment of transition, when you feel yourself, your country, saying goodbye to something without quite knowing, but still dreading what's coming next. When that happens, you sometimes find peace in the most unexpected ways. Carla got back on her bike, learned from a friend, and then slowly started venturing out into the city on her new toy.
Podías pedalear por las calles así y no sé, y sentir el viento y a veces me encantaba, por ejemplo, cuando llovía, porque ahí llueve, en el Caribe llueve de pronto y se va a caer el mundo y a los 15 minutos se acabó. Y eso me encantaba, eso me así era como una liberación, ¿no? Y me relajaba muchísimo.
The world presses in on you, your choices, limited as they were, feel even more constrained, and you go about your business, seeing everything, taking it in, aware of the impending collapse. Because in Cuba in the 90s, there was so little you could control, so little personal autonomy. But on a bicycle...
Claro, y si quiero doblar por aquí, doblo por aquí, si quiero cambiar de opinión, cambio de opinión y me voy por el otro lado y eres tú el único que... Todo depende de la resistencia de tus pies, de física, ¿no? Si ya te cansas, bueno, no, pero todo depende de ti.
And this is what I want to leave you with, what I can't stop thinking about since Carla and I spoke several weeks ago. A country that feels different, where doors that were always open are now suddenly and firmly closed, where there is danger and unease, a crisis you can see in the faces of your neighbors and your family and your friends, one you can feel in the pit of your stomach, anxiety almost indistinguishable from hunger, the creeping sense that one day you'll have to leave, though you don't know how you'll manage it or where you'll go. But at night, the rains come and the sleeping city is scoured clean and you put a cassette in your Walkman.
Yo escuchaba mucho Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd me acompañó muchísimo en la bicicleta.
And so you pull on your headphones, shut out the world, and ride home along dark, empty streets, feeling very briefly as though nothing could stop you, except the sea. Thank you. Thank you so much. So at this point, I'd like to invite two of my colleagues up on stage. First, Carolina Guerrero is the CEO of Radio Ambulante. And Annie Correal is a correspondent for the New York Times. She's also a co-founder of Radio Ambulante, and she's going to lead us in a conversation. Annie.
We can keep switching.
Hello.
Welcome. Thank you guys all for coming to the podcast club. We'll give you a brief intro of how we met.
Sure.
Yeah. So we didn't know each other at all, right? Caro found me through a mutual friend or Facebook, and they had this idea. So can you guys just talk a little bit about what the initial idea was and why you felt there was a place for it?
Do you want to do that, or should I?
Yeah, you should talk about the idea again.
The idea was I'd always wanted to do esa cosa de la radio, like that. I'd always been an idea of mine since I'd been asked to do a regular documentary in Peru in 2008, and I did it, and I was happy, but I was sort of unhappy because it wasn't in Spanish. It was for the BBC, and so we always had that idea, and Carolina and I talked about it a lot, and then one day we were just like, let's do it. And we'd heard your piece Kidnap Radio on This American Life.
Yeah, so like one thing that we need to add is that we came with this great idea, like, oh, let's do like This American Life in Spanish. And oh yeah, great idea from Latin America. And we sent a bunch of emails and to Latin American journalists. We received a lot of enthusiasm, but there was a problem. We didn't know anything about radio or how to do it. And then I remember like, oh, Annie produced this story. Let's call this woman.
Out of the blue.
She must know. She must know
I
how
must
to do
know
this.
how, and I had made like one full-length radio documentary ever.
Which was one more than we'd
But
made.
Right.
This American Life, no? I mean, that was validated.
That's the thing. You make one thing for This American Life, and people think you can do it all.
Yeah.
But we met and we decided, okay, let's go ahead with this. Let's think of what we want to do. And I remember very clearly saying, so do we want this to be a public radio program? Where do we want it to be available? Should we do a podcast? And Daniel was like, I don't know, podcasts?
Well, that's funny because when I sent that first thing of emails, I sent it out to a bunch of people, and I had a lot of people, surprisingly, that I knew who worked in public radio. And I got an email back from somebody who worked in public radio, who was Latino, who spoke Spanish, it was a 2-line email that said, this all sounds great, but then what? Podcasts? And so I was probably like channeling that skeptic, you know?
So I don't think any of us knew.
I had a flip phone also at that time. So.
But I really don't think any of us knew what was about to happen. This was 6 years ago. It was, there were not as many people in the game. It was This American Life, there was Radio Lab, but it's not what it's like today.
It was more than 6 years ago, wasn't it?
It was 6?
8.
8?
Yeah, like 2011.
Oh my God. Oh my God. So it was a different landscape. And I think the obstacles to making something like this happen in general, but also in another language, were significant and not to be underestimated. So I want to flash forward to what life is like now. If you can give us a sense of where your audience is, how old people are, who are you finding that this podcast really resonates with?
Okay. So, one thing that is important is that we believe that we were part of public media. We are not, but nobody was taking or picking Radio Ambulante. So we published always as a podcast. And I think we came at a good time, and we learned very quick. We had people like you or other people involved in the project that got enthusiastic. It seems that everybody had the same idea. But then we have to build the first, we didn't grew someone's audience. We just built it. Spanish language, long form doesn't exist in Spanish at all. For audio, in audio it doesn't. So it was it required first Twitter follower, first listener, everything like that. And pretty much the demographics are the same, kind of now that we are distributed by NPR 7 years after launching. It has been grow like that, but it's 70% of our listeners are in the United States, 28% in Latin America, and 2% in some other 100 countries or around the world, and it's so beautiful because we can see in Cabo Verde we have 3 listeners, and so technology is so great. And mostly most of our listeners are between 18 and 45, but this is what we know in terms of demographic, is very connected people. Many people listen to Radio Ambulante, to other podcasts, and then they discover, there is a Spanish language offer that I never heard of. But mostly it has been a lot of social media presence and mouth to mouth.
And the other thing is that it's really interesting because you can see people discover it. You can see people will tweet at us or write us on Facebook or whatever, and they'll say, they just discovered Radio Ambulante, and they'll listen to, 100 episodes in 2 weeks, because there's nothing else quite the same. Now the Spanish language ecosystem of podcasts is growing, and that's fantastic. But we've been at it for a really long time. So we learned in public, our first season is unlistenable. For me, I find it unlistenable.
No, it's not that bad.
Yeah, I find it I find it hard to, especially my tracking, I think is far.
That's true, but
yeah.
besides that,
besides the tracking, it's fine. But it's I remember we did a 3-season pilot. Of course, you remember. And I think the entire first season, those 3 pilots were listened to 7,000 times. And I write novels, and when I publish a book in Peru, and if it were a book in Peru, it would be sold 7,000 copies of a book in Peru. That's a runaway bestseller. And so I always thought, that's pretty cool. 7,000 people listen to this. That's, because I was thinking in terms of book sales. And then the next season we had 70,000, and the next season after that we had 700,000, and then it just kept growing and growing and growing. And so that's when I was like, okay, well maybe I'm not going to write a book for a while. I'm going to do this.
And so that's interesting because it's not just about growing an audience and sort of telling people, look, this thing can exist. It might not sound like what you're used to hearing on the radio. It's this other thing. But there is an oral tradition in Latin America. There are people who sit around and tell stories. It's part of people's DNA to an extent. What was it like in terms of training your producers, the people who are actually making the work, and who are they? Are they journalists? Are they novelists? How did you find the producers to do the work?
Well, I'm a novelist, and I have written a lot of long form, so I was like, oh, I think I know how to do this, and I realized I didn't know how to do this. Not just the technical stuff of recording, which you can pick up in 30 minutes. It was more like how to write with tape. I think that's something that I'm still learning how to do, and I find it to be a really interesting and really fun challenge. It's a completely different way of writing from writing, a print piece for, Wired or the Times Magazine or whatever. It's completely different. And I've really enjoyed that. So I think one advantage that I have from having learned I started doing this in my 30s, is that I like at that point, I'm very conscious of how I'm learning, and then it makes it a little bit easier for me to pass it on to other folks. So everybody who works the team basically started out as an intern. Our senior editor, our editors, everyone started out, and we all sort of learned together. You only learn by doing it. And then what I like a lot about it, which is very different from writing a novel, is that you work in collaboration with people. So it's like very, very collaborative, and you sit around a table and listen to tape together and read scripts together. And if it sounds dumb, no one has to tell you, because you can just look in their faces and you can tell. And I think that's a great way to learn. And we've had a number of challenges. One is like the geographic reality of the fact that we're in 12 different cities. That makes it hard to us to sit around a table. But the essence of what we do is listening to tape together, more than one person, to try to figure out what's the best way to tell a story and try to get other people excited about your stories. We almost always end up hiring our interns if we can afford to, because it's you invest time in training them, and then you want to keep them.
And are the listening habits of the audience, would you say that it's different than the general audience?
The general...
Like in Latin America, are people listening to podcasts while they wash their dishes or, commute to work? Do you hear from your listeners about how?
Yeah, there are not many long form narrative or like podcasts yet. There are like many more like being created right now, like while we talk is becoming, because of course it's becoming a thing, but it's not, the format was not common. So there are podcasts that are more like interview, or like two people talking about movies, like books, whatever. And I think those podcasts usually have a very clear niche, like small, but traffic, like I think we have our listeners are mostly in Colombia, in Mexico, in Peru. I think cities with a lot of traffic, that helps. But also like 4 years ago, we survey our audience since day one, and because our listenership is bigger now, we have realized a big shift between like 4 years ago. People were like, oh, what other podcasts do you listen to? Oh, This American Life. Oh, like a bilingual person in Latin America listening also to podcasts here. So they used to listen This American Life on their cell phone, but like Ambulante on the desktop, no? So that has been shifting, and people now are using their cell phones more. I think commute sometimes is a bit dangerous to take in Latin America. But here, that's in Latin America, has special conditions depending on where you live. But in the United States, I think they do, this is just, they incorporate Ambulante on their...
Yeah, I thought that was really surprising routines. When we did an audience survey a couple of years ago, that even folks who had smartphones were listening to Ambulante on their computers at home, because they wouldn't take their phone out on the bus, just different reality.
Yeah, it's like the way that we consume media can also instruct you as what you produce. You know, how long are each segment going to be and that sort of thing. So
yeah, I want to add something that because this is like, I mean, we are here telling you the story of like what I feel is a very successful project, but it has been like very like we have cried a lot. Because monetizing Ambulante has been a challenge, mostly because we are based in New York, but it was created in San Francisco, and we always heard this question like, oh yeah, sounds great, but why don't you do it in English? And we were like, no, because this personal journalism has to be told in the voice of the characters, and so it has been challenging to find like a sustainable business model, and then like I forgot my idea. Like so at the beginning we were able to produce only 10 episodes per year. So imagine like asking people to incorporate like your podcast to their routines with 10 episodes per year. 10 episodes is nothing. So now, since we joined NPR 2 years ago, we are producing we are a weekly show. We are mostly producing 24 to 30 episodes per year. And that's helping us. We became a weekly show, and that helped a lot.
Awesome. So I just want to maybe move it toward audience questions. We can go back and forth. I have a few more things to ask, but maybe we can let our audience direct us.
Great.
There's some mics, so
Yeah, there's questions.
Over here.
Hi there. Oh, is this working? Yeah. One of the statistics you mentioned just now, just not so long ago, 70% of listenership actually here in the States, only 30% in Latin America. That seems the inverse of the population of Spanish speakers. Totally. What would you attribute that to? Is it because there isn't this kind of tradition of, I don't know, public radio, long form, or is it something else?
I think so. With the caveat that we're all theorizing here because we haven't done a deep study on it, but I think it's a number of things. I think cell phone plans until very recently didn't include a lot of data, which seems like a basic building block of any sort of podcast industry in any country. So there's that. I think there's the fact that the kind of narrative, long form audio journalism that we're talking about comes out of a public radio tradition. So here, where there's people already know how to listen to this stuff because we've been taught by IRA, and before that, right? And so in Latin America, this particular kind of radio doesn't exist. So people have to sort of like listen to it so they'll know they'll like it. And Camila, our senior editor, always tells a story that her sister had to basically like lock her in a car and play This American Life for her. Because she was like, nah, I'm not gonna like that. That sounds really boring. And she did lock her in a car, and she did listen to it. And now she's the senior editor of Ambulante, and I think that's a really like important story. I have lots of family members who've never listened to Ambulante in Peru because they can't figure out how to listen to it because why would you like wait what on my phone like all these different barriers that some of which are technological, cultural.
What you just mentioned there about locking someone in a car and getting them to listen to it, that's how I made my wife a podcast fan. When we went on honeymoon, I said, hey, do you want to try out podcasts? We're going on this long road trip around Portugal.
Sounds risky on your honeymoon.
but that's and the show she really loved was yours. So
really?
She's an addict. Yeah.
Great.
So thank you.
Thank you.
I'd add also that I think it highlights how many Spanish speakers there are in the U.S.
Yeah.
That they can, it's seamlessly move into a new language while carrying through their normal listening.
Yeah, and I think I can add that this podcast has the same problem or like challenge that any other podcast have, like the discovery problem, no? Like might we make people discovering our podcast in Latin America for sure and here as well. So I think the potential is very.
Yeah, with the added obstacle that in Latin America, you have to tell them, wait, first, what's a podcast? And then you're like, okay, and if you're going to listen to that, okay, try Ambulante.
But it's changing. That's changing very quick. Yeah, we have one question.
Thank you. My question is actually about what you were talking about getting discovered. I discovered Radio Ambulante via Roman Mars on 99% 3-4 years ago. I'm curious to know what was the moment where you kind of, not peaked, but like, oh my God, I just discovered this awesome podcast in Español. When was that? Was it Roman? Was it before that? Was it after that?
When did we see the bump?
Yes.
In the audience.
I think we quickly start creating partnerships. The public media distributors were not into Ambulante, but the shows were. Some shows were, because remember 6 years ago, not many people were interested in producing Latin American content. They didn't know how to find stories. So we had a very successful story with Radio Lab. I think that was.
I think that would be
was one of the about a Cuban self-infected. How do you say that in English?
Self-infected AIDS patients in Cuba.
Yeah, a very. Yeah. So that was certain powerful stories. We had a partnership with 99% Invisible.
Done stuff with This American
something
Life.
This American Life too.
With Yuri Herrera, when Yuri went to Ciudad Juárez.
Yeah. So I think that was important, to get discovered, and also some other people who could understand the content, saying, "Oh, this is great." Yeah, but it was just a lot of social media, and discovery and partnerships and social media presence.
I think the change for me that I've noticed that is the most the coolest is when I go do literary events in Latin America mostly. People will go and they'll say, "I didn't know you wrote books." That, and a friend of mine who's an illustrator, she said she was at a design and illustration conference in Chile, and she was hanging out, and everyone was talking about how they listen to Ambulante when they draw, which also was this niche of Latin American animators and illustrators. I think is a pretty cool niche to have, and one of them said to her "Oh, isn't it funny that he has the same name as that writer?" And it's it's pretty funny.
Over here.
Hi. I was wondering, your stories are so varied, and I was wondering what the process was for selecting what you were going to do and when, and how long a normal story takes to develop.
Our stories, we try to have a geographic diversity because we are a regional project. So we wouldn't have 5 stories in a row from Colombia. So there's that. We try to mix it up with tone. One of the complaints we get a lot is
with mood.
The mood is that the stories are dark and dark and dark, and that's a huge challenge. And yet, I feel like the audience doesn't really know what they want, because then we do a story like Palacio Justicia, and our listenership is off the charts, and that's not a happy story. It's a difficult story. It's a brutal story. It's a beautifully told story from our producer David Trujillo. But so people always complain they want happier stories, but then you do a terribly sad story and everyone loves it, and they tweet at you lloré todo el camino al trabajo, they're like, "Thank you, Ambulante, I didn't stop crying for an hour." And you're so you never, you can't, we try to mix up the tone and mix the funnier, lighter, more delightful stories with the more investigative stuff, and we go through, I'd say maybe 6 to 8 months is the average for a story. So we have probably 15, 20 stories at different stages of production at any moment in time. We have the rest of the season mapped out already, and the beginning of next season already, in some stage of production. Yeah, any of these?
So first, I just want to say thank you, because I learned Spanish a lot through Radio Ambulante. And I'm a social worker now with unaccompanied minors in Oakland. Oh, wow. And I just want to know what your thoughts are about how do we use the podcast, I think, in educational settings to help both Spanish speakers learn English and English speakers learn Spanish, because I found it really useful.
Great. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. One important thing is that we created Radio Ambulante because we never saw ourselves reflected on media. it was something that, and as you see, I'm not a native English speaker, so we both, if you don't know, we are also married, if it's kind of confusing, but we have different migrating stories. Daniel grew up here. He was brought by his parents when he was 3. He grew up in Alabama, in Birmingham. I came 20 years ago because I wanted to move from Bogota, just like that. And then Annie, you were like Californian, Colombian.
I came over to this. I was born in Bogota, arrived at 5. So
yeah, and I think, and also like we had another co-founder, Martina. She was born in Virginia, I think, but from Uruguayan parents. And I think it's like the point that we found is that there was not like that common thing. We couldn't find anything for us. And I think the step 1 will be like playing these to people who need to know that they can relate to some story. It's already like an educational thing. We produce a story, probably you heard like the one about accompanied minors in the high school in Oakland and last year, and many people have written to us telling us that they have been using that on high schools, and many mostly in Oakland as well. So that sense of like connection with the story is important. I think with Ambulante, the great part for like even like what we think is that we bring people closer to Latin America, even Latin Americans, because I'm Colombian, but I don't really like, I never understood like really, I thought I knew about Latin America until I created Radio Ambulante. And for an example is like Daniel told me about an early story about an Argentinian guy, and he has this accent, Argentinian accent from Cordoba, and I didn't know there was such things, but of course, no, how ignorant I was. That accent was different. So I think just we feel that we create this regional conversation. But I think in Radio Ambulante you can just like choose a theme, a subject of conversation, and go and find stories that have like personal connection to the story. Like you say like, oh, LGBTQ, you can go to our discovery page and find like 5 stories from different countries about alternative, like different kind of love, or like legal issues, or like marriage, or like families, like these kind of stories. And I think, or like you can do about freedom of the press, or genre, like, like politics. So the way people use our content is just going to find the kind of subjects that they want to talk about, and creating curriculum of questions, having people listening to it, both English, teachers, English teachers and Spanish language, they are using the same. They just create conversation around different episodes on the subject of conversations, of like the subject of their classes.
I wanted to add, I think, makes me really happy that you used Ambulante to learn Spanish. I think that's we didn't obviously anticipate that being like a core part of our audience, but it has been, and it makes us very happy. That people, you're using it in classrooms in colleges and universities across the country. And in hindsight, it makes total sense. Because it's a place where you can hear all the different accents in Latin America, and you're not hearing like, Juan va al mercado a comprar zapatos, but like actual real conversations that people have about really, ideally very interesting things. And it's something that we want to work on. We feel like we want to offer that particular segment of our audience more tools, so that the content can be even more useful to them in language acquisition. So that's like one of the projects that we're working on for the coming year.
Is it on? Okay.
Hello, hi.
Hi. So first I want to say thank you, because I felt like you were saying about having representation. I totally feel that, because I listen to so many podcasts. I've been living here for 10 years. And there's nothing like you guys, so thank you for the stories that you put out there, because there's just nothing else like it.
Thank you so much.
And then, I feel like the way that Latin America is being portrayed in the present, I was very touched by John Leguizamo and his Broadway show, which is now on Netflix, Latin History from Orange, which I think everybody should see. So, you see how he took the responsibility to try to educate us about our history and everything that was that's not being taught to us, and especially to people in the US. Do you guys feel like that sense of responsibility moving forward with the narrative around Latin Americans in the stories that you're putting out there in the future and right now?
That's a really tough question. That's a really tough question. So, in my earlier life, I was a novelist, and I think that if anyone had ever said like you've got to be responsible as a novelist, you like it just makes me like it's very stifling and it feels very bad. Like no, like if someone wants me to write a novel about this, I'm like no, I'm going to write about that. So that's that artist that I still have in me that bristles at the idea of responsibility. And people always say, do you imagine, who do you imagine your audience to be? And I was like, I don't know. I never imagine who my audience is when I'm writing a novel. I never think about my reader is. I just write for me. And that's a very selfish act, as art often is and probably should be. When it comes to Ambulante, I do feel slightly differently. I feel like we are the only Spanish language podcast on public radio, on NPR. And I think that the very fact of being a Spanish language podcast in this particular political climate carries with it a certain responsibility. That doesn't mean that every story we're going to tell is going to be about La Caravana, but it means that immigration and the media portrayals about Latinos in the United States are going to be it's part of our purview, it's part of our beat. I think we have to look at that. We've done stories, we do stories about immigration all the time. We try to find interesting and new angles. We try to always be human. We don't believe the tropes of the dangerous brown other person. We don't believe that. We don't believe that Latinos are always the tragic victims. We don't believe that we're the monsters. We know that we are, like everyone else, a multifaceted, complex community with subtle differences in class and race and geography and linguistic background and everything, like in any other community. And we try to tell those human stories. I think personally that just being honest about what you don't know, and like being, as an editor, my role is always to be very curious, that we're trying to tell stories that we don't know but want to know about. And then in the process of doing that, we're hopefully doing something that serves our community. Even if we don't do it, with fists raised like that, it is part of our responsibility.
Yeah, one thing that I want to add is that I think just like showing, like keeping in mind that the world is bigger than the United States is important, and that just doing that, this is a statement for us. And this is like, of course, like Annie covers for the New York Times. You have been covering the caravan and everything.
Family separations.
Yeah, and then but when you go to Honduras or Guatemala or like Central American countries, like they are not covering like what's happening in the border as like heavy as it should be covered. This is not what I'm telling. What I'm telling is that there is a perspective when you see it from the rest of the world, and I think just putting like faces to like data and stereotypes, creating a different image. We don't produce positive content so they can see that Latinos are so great, because we are actually like the most violent cities in the world are in Latin America, unfortunately in Colombia many. It's just like showing like the human experience is complex and what the human being passed through with this kind of narrative just can create some empathy, and as Daniel says, like just like learning who your neighbor is and might be like a way to understand the world that is bigger than the US.
I would add, I made me think of this. We did a story last year called No Country for Young Men, where I went to Honduras for 3 weeks, and I started by reporting on an Honduran woman here in Long Island, and sort of covering her day and the way she worked to earn the money that she sent back to Honduras. And then in Honduras, I went to visit her family and sort of see how that money was spent. But I also was very adamant. I was like, I want to do a story that isn't about the violence in Honduras, because that's all you ever hear about Honduras, las maras, and and the first night I was there, I randomly ended up at this house where there was this band playing. They were recording. I was invited to this party with all these musicians who were recording the chorus to their song, Pura Mierda. which was his protest song, and I ended up being in the chorus. And eventually, like, my name is tiny in the little credits of the video on YouTube. But it was like a very, very proud moment. But at the same time, I hadn't yet visited the country, so I didn't know what they were mad about, And I felt that at the end of my 3 weeks in Honduras, I would have liked to have gone back and sang it again, because I feel like now I could understand why they were so mad, and I could really shout "pura mierda" and feel it, And part of what my anger would have been was that I tried really hard to do a story about Honduras. It wasn't about the violence. I tried really, really hard, and it was just inescapable. And there's no way to sugarcoat that, and there's no positive spin you can put on that. It's just a really tough place right now, and people are doing their best, and not always getting by, And it was heartbreaking. It was really heartbreaking. But I also was very adamant about writing that scene into the story, because it was, you don't think of hipsters in Tegucigalpa recording a punk rock song as being Honduras, but that's also Honduras. It doesn't mean they're exempt from the violence. Doesn't mean they're exempt from the reality around them. It's just that life doesn't stop. You still make music. You still make art. You still, have a beer and tell jokes and fall in love and do all these other things that people do. It's just life.
I'd also like to add, obviously this question made us all think a lot. Covering immigration for the Times has been challenging. There's also there's much more interest. That's one side of what's happening with the Trump administration's controversial policies, is that more people are reading and paying attention to immigrant stories virtually than we've ever seen before. And I think one challenge is, like Daniel was saying, to avoid these easy categories of victim or villain. But the challenge is, how do you do that? And how do you not veer toward the sentimental if you're looking at something like family separations? And I think one answer to that is human voices. To have the mother, the child, to not say it was a sobbing mother and she was inconsolable, because these are buzzwords, or these are things that make us feel we're not reading something that is objective anymore. But when you hear the voice, and when you hear the 3-year-old, you suddenly are brought into the room and you understand who these people are in a way that really transcends what you can narrate as a journalist. So I think that's why I've been recording everything, with family separations and with reporting on the caravan for 10 days. I just had my iPhone in my hand the whole time and had it on, because I think that's the material that's going to cut through the stereotypes and also the numbness that people have increasingly around immigration topics. So, and luckily I think we're going to do something with a lot of the tape that we couldn't use for the daily podcast with Radio Ambulante, to kind of, not just because it's powerful content, but because I think we all agree that it's a really important part of the historical record to actually have the families who were separated, and to have the voices of the children. So I think that if it comes down to responsibility, we always feel that, especially if we're journalists who are covering the story of the day, and we want to make sure that we expose whatever is happening. But it's something that I think radio is playing a particularly powerful role right now.
Yes, I had a technical question. Mm-hmm. You said early on that writing for tape, writing for this form, was very, very different from writing narrative fiction. Yeah. Could you explain that a little more?
Yeah. Writing with tape feels a lot more like sculpting, in that you begin with a transcript, you begin with audio, and usually what I'll do is, say I have an hour-long interview, I'll remember parts of it that I definitely want to include, but I'll just go through and listen to it and start cutting immediately, like this part, this part, this part. And at the end of the hour, I'll have maybe 40 different cuts, and then I'll transcribe cuts, and then I'll start putting them in a kind of order, and then I'll start writing the connective tissue between those bits of tape. I've just been reporting the story, and I was in Chile for 2 weeks, 10 days just now, and I have a ton of tape, and I haven't gone through any of it yet. I haven't had time, but every night I would write these long memos to my editors, and that would just be notes, and some of that I may end up using in some form of the narration, but I would do a lot of just things that I probably wouldn't do in radio, like spend a lot of time describing how a person looked, or their apartment, or I described a scene at a courthouse where I wasn't allowed to record audio. So it's just writing. I gotta say, when I reported a story in Puerto Rico last spring about the recovery of the electrical grid, and I didn't record any audio, and it felt brilliant. It felt like flying, because it was just me and a notepad and a pen, and I was like, this feels like very freeing, So I like all of it. All of it I like. They're just very, very different. Hello.
Can you tell me where the name came from? Because I always felt that Radio Ambulante was similar to like a vendedor ambulante, a street vendor, and I always thought it was kind of cool. So yeah.
Yeah, we will pass it to the person who came finally with the name, who was Annie.
It could have been any. We had like a list of. You found it recently. It was like 200 different names. We put it in a spreadsheet. We had people vote. We were really close to calling it Radiola. Yeah. And then I think we realized that it was one letter off from Radiolab. I know. So I think it was process of elimination, and we did feel that it was a symbol that, like you said, is like a feature of most, if not all, Latin and Latin American cities, was the ambulante. The street vendor. Yeah, the street vendor, but also like we loved the idea right away, and she was like, I don't know if it looks like ambulance, and we're like, no, this is perfect. That was my concern.
Yeah, but it represented basically.
When we saw the logo, I think is when we really we had our designer was Alvaro Villanueva, and Alvaro, we settled on the name, and he started sketching, and it is this guy pushing a cart that's a radio. And I think when we saw that, we were all just like, yes, that's it.
It represents like the moving, but also the resilience of Latin Americans, I think. Yeah.
And as many of you probably know, you just hear people hawking things when you're on the streets in Latin American cities. Like, it's part of your experience, your auditory experience, is hearing people get on the altoparlante and say tomates or whatever it might be.
Do you remember that we had thought originally that we would start every episode with an interview of an ambulante?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I found actually one of them that we had that was an interview with a guy who spoke perfect Spanish, but he'd learned it like in Ecuador or somewhere, and now was like living in Queens and sold like tomatoes in like Jackson Heights or something. I don't know, but he wasn't even Latino. He was from like Belgium or something.
Well, now that the podcast has such an enormous audience, maybe we should subject them to.
Yeah. No, it's just funny. Yeah, I like the rebusque of it. The fact that you have to that the ambulante is one like the hustler. I think that's really important to us. Makes a great tattoo also.
Hey guys, so I actually have a confession, I guess. I'm not a listener. I'm a secondhand listener. I'm here with my husband and my friend who are avid listeners. But I hear the stories through them, at dinner or when we go get a drink or something. But I actually haven't listened. So I guess the question for you guys is, if I had to start, which I want to, what would you recommend? What is your favorite story, or one that you think would be very, sort of, I guess, a good place to kind of get introduced?
Do you have thick skin? Okay. I will point out 3 of my favorite stories. One actually was edited by Annie. It's called NN. It was early in the project. So it's about, do you remember what
I do. And I just saw the producer, Nadia. Recently. It's about a town in Colombia where there were so many bodies floating down the river that were ending up in fosas communal mass graves, that the people of the town started adopting the bodies. And they would bring them flowers and paint their little spots. And it wasn't a totally selfless act. They believed that the souls of these people brought them good luck. And so this was a really intense story about the way that people adapt to just unbelievable violence. So we had Nadia, who's a Canadian producer, there, and she spent quite a bit of time. And eventually, she found people who sort of fought over a body and eventually came to share it and sort of have shifts where they would come and...
Don't spoil.
Oh yeah, no spoil. So yeah, that's a pretty...
Can I tell a more lighthearted one, maybe?
Yeah. No, you go.
Okay, okay. That one's bleak. It's beautiful story, but a little bit bleak. There's one of my favorite stories is called Cassettes del Exilio.
Yeah,
and Cassettes is about our producer Dennis, who's from Chile, and he's done some of our best stories. He's wonderful. Dennis tells the story of his family. His father they were forced into exile, and at a certain point in his youth, after the Pinochet overthrew Allende, his father's living in France, and his mom and his brothers and sisters are living in Santiago, and the only way they communicated was with these cassettes that would be sent back and forth. And what happened was, 30 years later, they found the box of tapes in the back of a closet, and they listened to them. And what he found that was, again with no spoilers, that was amazing was that the tapes, on the one hand, were the tapes that his dad made in France that were for the kids, that were like these really elaborate radio plays about French culture and trying to to make these connections. And on the other side, they were the B-side was the private tapes with the mom. And what you have there is sort of an audio document of a marriage falling apart under the strain of distance and exile. And it's just a beautiful story about fatherhood and family and politics and marriage. And it's one of my absolute favorite pieces we've ever done.
Yeah. What about you? What do you recommend?
Well, I just listened to the Palacio de Justicia, which is, I think it, to me, feels like a turn in what you guys are doing. I think that there's been this rich, beautiful, I think music is one of the things that really makes Radio Ambulante feel lively and different, and there's always a little bit of attitude. But I feel like felt like I'm hearing tape, historical tape, archival tape of a really huge episode in Colombia's history that I've never heard before, that's going to make me think about everything differently. And I think that so I have to say that's one of my favorite things you guys have ever done. And I think it sets the bar very high, but it's going to make people really, it will open people's minds to what we can do using tape to tell some of the stories that haven't been told about Latin America's history. So
I will just ask the funny one. I know Gastronomía Peruana, that was produced by Daniel. That's on the funny, just so you won't get depressed and you will continue listening. We have a queue, the catalog is 120 stories, so we could recommend them all, but start there.
I think you should start with
start with the
Peruvian.
Yeah, the Peruvian is about Peruvian, so that's very good.
That's a fun one. More questions? Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. A question about the future of your show. So the only other language I speak from English is Hebrew, so no Spanish for me. I just like the show. I try to listen, try to understand. So I know they have a show called Israel Story, which is probably as diverse as Radio Ambulante, in that it's about tech, it's about people, it's about this, it's about that. But as the scene grows for Spanish-speaking podcasts, do you think that your show is going to get more niche? Do you think you'll start focusing on one thing, or instead of being all over the map?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so. We were just talking about maybe creating other shows because we're like, but we are still a medium. I mean, it's like we used to be a small team, now we're like a medium-sized team, but depending of who you compare us with. So we hope that we can like maybe develop other more like serious like his work, like he's working on a it's like true crime international series. I don't know how you define that, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like following a
that I would
story
use true
that
crime.
is more like political and like has like many. It's like a multi-continent story. So it's gonna take like another year or so.
Yeah.
So we're talking about that. Like I think Radio Ambulante. One thing is Radio Ambulante Studios, the company, and the other one is Radio Ambulante Podcast. So we were like hoping to grow to a point that Radio Ambulante Podcast has a brand and a workflow and all that. And I think we're gonna be very close to it.
I would say the other thing is that we have certain, we're very aware of this, built-in advantages over other Spanish language podcasts. One of them is the fact that we're based in the States, that we were created in the States, and that we're not a Colombian podcast, we're not a Peruvian podcast, we're not a Puerto Rican podcast, we're a regional podcast. And by virtue of that, our purview is very big. And that's just in the founding DNA of the project. The team is incredibly international. So I lose count now how many cities, because we added Miranda last week, but now it's like 12 cities, I think. And makes for very interesting editorial conversations about what's important and what isn't. And we were talking about the air in California, and then our new intern was talking about, oh yeah, the volcano here just blew up. So it's the same, like we're having all these, just by virtue of being so international, our team, we're going to end up looking at things in a very broad way. And then always trying to take something very local and make it universal, make it understandable for people who are not from that country in the context.
Yeah, but there are many more like niche or local podcasts being created now. We're like advising some of like those creators, and I think you're gonna start like seeing more and more and more niche, but not probably directly from us. Yeah.
Thanks, guys, for doing this. So, as she mentioned, I've been a listener now for a long time, and one of the things that's always struck me about this particular podcast is the way that you guys are able to get your subjects, the people that the stories are about, to open up and share these often brutal and always intense stories. There's an element of trust that must come with that, and I'd imagine a relationship that's built. Do you guys keep in touch with any of these people after the stories are published? Is there an Ambulante network?
Yeah, it's one of the first stories we ever did was the easy answer is yes. In some cases, not always, but in many cases, yes. We did a live show in Brooklyn in September, and one of the subjects of one of our very first stories came with his wife now. And that was super cool to see him. I've done events. One of the first stories we ever did in the first season was called Todos Vuelven, Everyone Returns, and it was about basically a Peruvian reporter recorded the last week of her best friend living in Barcelona and moving back to Peru during like sort of like the tail end of the economic crisis in Spain, and like a lot of Peruvians just who were abroad just quit, gave up, and moved back to Peru. And so she recorded that. And then one day I was in Lima, and this woman comes up and she's like, "Hey, I'm that friend," like, and that was really, really cool. You remember that story? I'm like, yeah, oh my God, yeah. We took a picture and sent it to the reporter, So yeah, it happens all the time. Then there's things like the Honduras story I mentioned, where I spent several weeks, reporting in Long Island with this woman who cleans houses, and then contacting her family with her permission, obviously, in Honduras. And then when the story came out, I called her to tell her, hey, the story's out, and the number had been disconnected. She had no email, and there's no way to get in touch with her. And that stuff. Then, like, I felt really awful about that.
And some characters have died as well, like old people. Like Yeah, you know, like I mean, no, like it's like we no, like I mean, the map of the
yeah, the
like
map guy. That was
San Pelunge. You know, like yeah, we want to be, but we feel the grief. Like I mean, these stories are like old, like 6 years old, and then our character died, and we just tell people, like you know, like people are like grieving with us, like.
But yeah,
so
we did a story about a Swiss guy who moved to Lima, discovered in the 70s, and discovered that there was no map of Lima, there was which if you've been to Lima makes sense. And so he was like, oh, being Swiss, he was like, I'll make it, you know, and he made the map, and we got his story, and then and it's a beautiful story called Infinite City.
Yeah, Ciudad Infinita. That's Infinita. Also very good.
Yeah, it's a great one. And then like about 10 months after we published it, he passed away. So we didn't keep in touch with him, but other folks, yes.
That's one thing that I've loved. That's been a consistent feature of Radio Ambulante, is that it's just like the surprising episodes, and also these, you know, the presence of European and American, and the just crazy stuff. Like one of the live shows, which I don't know if you guys have been to any live shows in the tradition of pop-up magazine. I think that's been a way that you guys have reached a new audience as well.
Yeah.
But sure. Maybe you could just briefly mention the story about the Cuban grandmother who was obsessed with, what was it?
The Bixito.
Oh,
that's a WNYC
That's
story.
a WNYC story from Julie Longoria.
Oh, but that's great.
It's a great story. It's about the relationship. Basically, this reporter, young reporter, grandma was no matter what your ailment was, she was like Vicks Vapor Rub, which she called Viquisito, and Vicks Vapor Rub was just the, you know, if you had a cold, if your fingernails weren't, if you wanted to strengthen your hair, like she would shower with it, she'd like jam it up her nose, like for everything. And the reporter did a bunch of great interviews with her grandma about this, and then did some research on her own and found out sort of the story behind this is super interesting, which is that there was some kind of, right after Castro came to power in 1959, in the early 60s, in that kind of middle period, right before the Soviet Union came in, there was this kind of weird space, and the U.S. was negotiating to get some stuff out of Cuba, and what they paid in was just this giant cargo ship of Vicks Vapor Rub.
Are you spoiling the...
No. Well, I should also mention, because as much as I would love to take credit for that story, that was produced for WNYC for another show, first in English, actually. And then we had her, I believe, redo the interviews in Spanish. So I would love to take credit for that, but it was not. That's all.
Yeah,
Julia.
but I think the point is like that we really feel that Ambulante tells uniquely Latin American stories. Only those stories can be told in Latin American. For anyone Latin American, is like we were talking about the oral tradition, is that Daniel and I were like, oh, let's do, like we were listening to an episode of Radio Lab before creating Radio Ambulante, and we're like, oh, this is so good, and we're talking about it and obsessed. And then we were like, oh, I heard something similar, no? And you always heard it in the living room of your house in Latin America, because you have like, your friends are all, and your family members are all storytellers, and these stories are like really like inverosímil, how do you say, absurd, or like unique, and I think that's the narrative that we were not listening anywhere.
Well, and actually that story that began the evening, Nando Alvarez talking about his learning English, and the, you know, when were you ever most scared? That story he told us one night at this restaurant in San Francisco. We were having dinner, and we nearly like fell on the floor laughing. And so months later, when we were doing a live show, I was like, hey, Nano, can you tell me that story again? And it's like almost, you know, exactly like that.
I think also that's playing with stereotypes too, understanding that the audience isn't just Colombian or Chilean, so you're allowed to use those stereotypes in a playful way. Everyone thinks Colombians are violent. Okay, let's look at that. So I think it makes us aware too of certain things about our own culture, you know, and about other cultures, but in a way that isn't as heavy-handed.
Yeah.
There is another question.
It's not really a question. I'm just fangirling here since we all ask questions.
I'm glad the whole family asking questions.
Yes, we
Get
also
this
share
table
a
around a
car.
drink.
Yeah. We share. Thank you. No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for what you guys are doing. Like, I came here when I was 10, and when I found the podcast, it was just so like, okay, por fin, un poco de mi cultura, a little bit about my culture.
From where?
Ecuador.
Oh.
And we actually went to high school together, so we were long. So anyway, so it's just thank you so much for doing it. And I told my mom about it, and she started listening to it, and she was like, this is awesome, like how my grandfather used to listen to the radio back in the day. And then when you guys took a break in June, she calls me all upset, and she's like, what happened? What's the next episode? And I'm like, Mom, I'm sorry, they're coming back later. She's like, I have to wait for this, I have to wait for Game of Thrones, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like, she was so upset. But you guys have, I mean, my whole entire family listens to it now. Like, my siblings that don't speak English, speak Spanish, they are listening to it, so they kind of also learn.
Cool.
So you're amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That is so
thank
cool.
you. Yeah.
Yay.
That's so great. Do we have more time or no? Okay. So you have to, yeah.
Well, thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you guys so much for all the work that you do, for
No.
representing so many voices, so many places.
Thank you. This is like a reunion for us, so it's really great. And thank you
Yeah.
guys for all your great questions, and thanks to the Times and to
Yeah,
WNYC.
and thank you for opening this space. You know, like we are, Radio Ambulante is, everybody knows Radio Ambulante, but no, we are in no list. We are never invited to many conferences and places because it's like nobody understands. And I think it's amazing that the New York Times Podcast Club thought about bringing Radio Ambulante. This is so thoughtful, and we were expecting like, oh, maybe 6 people will be there. And so thank you all for coming, and also like
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving.